She handed me the eulogy she wanted me to read at my own father's funeral. I hadn't spoken to her in 6 years. I read it. Then I found out why she really wanted me there. Welcome back to the Betrayal Files, the channel for people who know that family doesn't always mean safety. If stories about quiet justice hit different for you, subscribe now because this one earns it. My name is Renata Voss. I was 34 the autumn my father died, and 34 the week I learned that grief in my family was just another tool sharpened and handed to whoever needed it most. I want to start before the funeral because you need to understand what 6 years of silence actually felt like before you understand why I almost didn't go. My father, Anton Voss, built cabinetry for 40 years out of a workshop behind our house in Millbrook, Ohio. He smelled like cedar and wood glue. He had hands like maps, lined and rough, and he never once raised his voice at me, not in 34 years. My mother, Delphine, was a different kind of person entirely. She ran our house the way some people run a courtroom, with verdicts, not conversations. My older sister, Justine, was the verdict she always favored. I left at 28. Not dramatically. No screaming match, no slam door you could point to later and say, "That's when it happened." It was slower than that. It was every holiday where my contributions got smaller in the retelling and Justine's got larger. It was my mother introducing me at a cousin's wedding as our other daughter, while Justine got a name. It was the year I paid off $4,000 of my parents' medical debt quietly, the way you do when you still believe quiet kindness gets noticed eventually, and watching Justine get a parade for buying them a turkey. The breaking point was almost embarrassingly small. I'd asked my mother gently if she could remember my husband Soren's name correctly just once. She'd called him Justine's husband, for the third time at Christmas dinner, in front of him. My mother told me I was being fragile. Justine told me I was making everything about myself as usual. I drove home that night, packed nothing, changed nothing, and simply stopped calling. 6 years of birthdays passed with no card either direction. 6 years of Thanksgivings I spent at Soren's parents' table instead, where people learned my name on the first try and never forgot it again. So when my mother called me in March, her voice cracking in a way I hadn't heard since I was a child, to tell me my father had collapsed in his workshop and wasn't going to wake up, I drove 4 hours through the night without asking myself a single question about why. That's the thing nobody tells you about estrangement. The door you closed on purpose doesn't actually lock. It just waits. I got to the hospital at 4 a.m. He was already gone by the time I arrived. A stroke, sudden, no warning, no goodbye. I stood in a hallway that smelled like antiseptic and stale coffee, and my mother hugged me for the first time in 6 years like nothing had happened at all. Like the 6 years were a coat I'd simply taken off at the door. Justine stood a few feet back, arms crossed, watching the reunion with an expression I couldn't read yet. I didn't know yet that I should have been reading it harder. The next 10 days blurred into logistics. Flowers, a casket, a obituary nobody asked me to help write, but that somehow credited Justine with carrying the family through this difficult time. I let it go. I told myself grief makes people petty and I wasn't going to be petty back. I was there for my father, not for the scorecard. 3 days before the funeral, my mother asked me to come by the house. She had something for me, she said. Her voice had that practiced softness again, the one I used to mistake for warmth before I learned to hear what was underneath it. She handed me 2 folded pages, my father's eulogy, written in her looping cursive, and asked if I would read it at the service. "Your father would have wanted his real voice up there," she said. "Not Justine's. Yours." I almost cried right there in the kitchen. 6 years of being the daughter who didn't quite count, and here finally was my mother choosing me for something that mattered. I should have noticed that she wasn't looking at me when she said it. She was looking at a manila folder on the counter, the kind with a metal clasp, the kind that holds documents instead of memories. I didn't think anything of it. I was too busy feeling, for the first time in 6 years, like I belonged in that kitchen. I read the eulogy that night at home, alone, out loud to Soren, practicing the cadence so my voice wouldn't break in front of 200 people. It was beautiful. My mother had written something genuinely beautiful about a man who deserved it. His patience, his hands, the chair he built for every grandchild before they were even born. I cried real tears reading it. I didn't know yet that the eulogy and the funeral were 2 separate gifts, and only one of them was actually for me. The service was at Halloway Funeral Home on a gray Saturday that smelled like rain that never quite arrived. I stood at the podium and read my father's words in my own voice, and for 4 minutes, I was simply his daughter again, nothing else. Justine sat in the front row dabbing her eyes with a tissue, and I remember feeling briefly something like peace. Maybe this was how we found our way back to each other. Maybe grief was the bridge nobody had been willing to build before. The reception was at my parents' house. That's where it happened. I was in the kitchen, washing serving dishes because somebody had to, and old habits don't die just because you've been gone 6 years, when I heard my mother's voice in the next room, low, urgent, talking to my Aunt Vivian. I wasn't trying to listen. The wall between the kitchen and the den in that house has never been thick. She read it perfectly, my mother said. Nobody's going to question anything now. Not after that. I stood very still with the casserole dish in my hands. And the papers? Vivian asked. Signed Thursday, before the service. Renata doesn't even know what she agreed to. I set the dish down so carefully it didn't make a sound. I walked into the den like I hadn't heard a single word, and I asked my mother, as casually as I could manage with my pulse in my ears, what paper she meant. She smiled at me the way she used to smile when I was 12, and she'd already decided I was wrong about something. Oh, just estate paperwork, sweetheart. Nothing for you to worry about. The lawyer needed signatures to release the funeral home payment. That's all. You signed a release form when you got here, remember? Routine. I did remember signing something. 3 days ago. In that kitchen. While I was still holding the eulogy she just handed me, still half crying, still grateful for the first time in 6 years to feel chosen. I hadn't read it carefully. I trusted her. That was the whole design, and I'd walked into it like it was an open door instead of a trap with a welcome mat. That night I drove home and didn't sleep. At 6 a.m., I called my father's attorney, a quiet, careful man named Garrett Pell who'd handled the Voss family's affairs for 15 years, and asked him point-blank what I had signed 3 days before my father's funeral. There was a long pause on the line, the kind lawyers give you right before they tell you something you're not going to like. Renata, he said, I think you should come into the office. If you've ever signed something while you were too busy grieving to read it, you already feel where this is going. Subscribe now because I'm about to walk you through exactly what was in that folder, and exactly what I did once I found out. Garrett Pell's office was small and quiet, the kind of place that smelled like old carpet and burnt coffee, and he had the document waiting on his desk when I arrived, already flagged with 3 yellow tabs. My father's will, written 4 years earlier, had split his estate evenly between Justine and me. The workshop, the equipment, the house, a modest but real life insurance policy, a little over $500,000 in total once everything was accounted for. Equal. 50-50. My father, for all his quiet ways, had never once made me feel like the lesser daughter. Not on paper, not where it counted. The document I'd signed in that kitchen wasn't a funeral home release. It was a disclaimer of interest, a legal instrument that lets an heir voluntarily renounce their share of an estate, which then passes automatically to the next eligible beneficiary. In this case, Justine. I'd signed away $500,000 3 days before I read my father's eulogy, and I hadn't even known I was holding the pen over anything but grief. It's notarized, Garrett said gently, like he already knew that word was a small bomb going off in my chest. Witness too. Your Aunt Vivian and a neighbor, a Mrs. Halloran. I sat there with my hands flat on the desk. The way you brace yourself against something that's already happened. Can it be challenged? Possibly, he said. Disclaimers can be voided if you can show fraud, duress, or that you weren't given a meaningful opportunity to understand what you were signing. Did anyone explain the document to you before you signed it? I thought back to that kitchen. The folded eulogy in my hands. My mother's voice, soft as a held breath, sliding the papers across the counter at the exact moment I was the most undone I'd been in 6 years. Just sign here, sweetheart, so the funeral home can be paid on time. I know this is so much right now. I've got you. No, I said. Nobody explained anything. Garrett nodded slowly, the way a man nods when a case just got a great deal more interesting. Then I think we have grounds. But Renata, I need you to understand something before we go further. If we challenge this, there's no quiet way to do it. Your mother will know exactly what you're doing, and exactly why. I thought about the den. She read it perfectly. Nobody's going to question anything now. I thought about 6 years of silence that I'd let myself believe was simply distance. Simply two people who'd grown apart, when really it had just been the calm before someone decided I was useful again. Good, I said. Let her know. Subscribe to the Betrayal Files if you've ever realized the kindness someone showed you had a price tag attached the whole time. New stories every week for people who know exactly how this feels. I didn't confront my mother right away. That's not how I work, and honestly it's not how Garrett works either. He believes, and I've come to agree, that the first move in a fight like this isn't a phone call. It's paper. Over the next 2 weeks we built the case the quiet way. Garrett requested the original notarized disclaimer from the county recorder's office. He requested the timeline of when the funeral home payment had actually cleared, which turned out to be Friday, the day after I signed, paid in full from the estate's existing checking account, the one that had more than enough to cover it without touching a single cent of either daughter's inheritance. There had never been a funeral home emergency. There had never been a reason for me to sign anything in that kitchen except that my mother needed me distracted, grateful, and holding something else in my hands. He also requested phone records, which is where it got worse. 3 calls between my mother and Justine in the 8 days leading up to the funeral, each one 12 to 20 minutes long. And 1 text message recovered from Justine's own account during discovery once we filed, that Justine had apparently never thought anyone outside the family would ever see. Mom, are you sure this works? What if she actually reads it? My mother's reply 11 minutes later. She won't. She'll be holding the eulogy. Trust me, I know my daughter. I sat in Garrett's office reading that exchange and felt something in me go very still and very cold. The particular stillness of finally understanding that you were never misunderstood by these people. You were understood completely. That was the whole problem. My mother hadn't miscalculated who I was. She'd calculated exactly who I was, and built a trap precisely shaped to fit me. I want to tell you what hurt worse than the $500,000 because money, it turns out, is the easy part of a story like this to recover from. What hurt was rereading that eulogy. The beautiful one. The one about my father's hands and his patience and the chairs he built for grandchildren not yet born. My mother had written something genuinely tender about a man she'd loved, and then used my love for him, my desperation to be chosen for something real after 6 years of exile, as the exact lever she needed to pry my signature loose. She hadn't just taken my inheritance. She'd taken the one moment at that funeral that had felt unconditionally mine and revealed it, retroactively, as bait. Justine called me once during those 2 weeks, not to apologize but to get ahead of it. Mom said you're doing something with a lawyer, she said. Her voice already armored with the particular outrage of someone who's been caught and is furious about the catching, not the conduct. Do you have any idea how that looks? Dad's barely in the ground and you're suing your own family. I'm not suing anyone yet, I told her. I'm asking a court to let me read a document I was never given the chance to read the first time. You should ask yourself why that idea scares you so much. She hung up. That was, I think, the most honest thing either of us said to each other in 6 years. The hearing was set for late June, 3 months after the funeral, in a small civil courtroom that smelled like every government building smells, like carpet cleaner and fluorescent light. My mother sat across the aisle with Justine and a lawyer I recognized from a billboard on the highway into Millbrook. The kind of lawyer you hire when you need someone loud, not someone careful. Garrett was careful. Garrett laid it out the way he'd laid it out for me that first morning, except this time for a judge. The timeline, the funeral home payment that had cleared from existing funds before my signature was even needed, the text messages, the absence of any independent counsel offered to me before I signed, the eulogy as a documented, intentional act of emotional misdirection. He didn't raise his voice once. He didn't need to. The text messages did the work that volume usually does in rooms like that one. My mother testified that she'd simply been trying to keep things calm during an emotional time. The judge, a woman with steel gray hair and a face that had clearly heard every excuse in the book, asked her directly why, if the document was routine, she'd waited until I was holding a handwritten eulogy to ask for my signature, rather than any of the other 6 days I'd been in town. My mother didn't have a good answer. There isn't a good answer. I watched her search for one anyway, watched her reach for the practiced softness that had worked on me my entire life, and watched it simply evaporate in a room full of strangers who had no 6 years of history convincing them to believe her. The judge voided the disclaimer. Fraud in the inducement, she called it, and ordered the estate redistributed according to my father's original will. 50-50. Exactly as he'd written it, for years before any of this, back when he still believed his daughters might handle his absence with some basic decency toward each other. My mother didn't speak to me on the courthouse steps. She didn't have to. Her face said everything her mouth had run out of room for. There's a version of this story where I tell you the money mattered most, and I won't pretend it didn't matter at all. But what I keep coming back to months later is something smaller. The day after the hearing, I drove out to my father's workshop, the one I now legally co-owned with a sister who hadn't spoken to me since the courtroom, and I let myself in with the spare key he'd given me when I was 16, the one I'd never returned even during the 6 years I stayed away. It still smelled like cedar. His tools were still hung on the pegboard exactly where he'd left them, each outline traced in marker so he'd always know if something was missing. I stood there for a long time just breathing it in, and I thought about how he'd built a chair for every grandchild before they were born, how careful and exact his hands had been with wood, and how careless his wife had been with the 2 daughters he'd left behind in equal deliberate shares. The judge voided the disclaimer. Fraud in the inducement, she called it, and ordered the estate redistributed according to my father's original will. 50-50. Exactly as he'd written it, for years before any of this, back when he still believed his daughters might handle his absence with some basic decency toward each other. My mother didn't speak to me on the courthouse steps. She didn't have to. Her face said everything her mouth had run out of room for. There's a version of this story where I tell you the money mattered most, and I won't pretend it didn't matter at all. But what I keep coming back to months later is something smaller. The day after the hearing, I drove out to my father's workshop, the one I now legally co-owned with a sister who hadn't spoken to me since the courtroom, and I let myself in with the spare key he'd given me when I was 16, the one I'd never returned even during the 6 years I stayed away. It still smelled like cedar. His tools were still hung on the pegboard exactly where he'd left them, each outline traced in marker so he'd always know if something was missing. I stood there for a long time just breathing it in, and I thought about how he'd built a chair for every grandchild before they were born, how careful and exact his hands had been with wood, and how careless his wife had been with the 2 daughters he'd left behind in equal deliberate shares. I don't know if Justine and my mother will ever speak to me again. Some days I think I don't want them to. Other days I think about that text message she'll be holding the eulogy, and I wonder if there was ever a version of my mother who loved me without an angle, or if I simply hadn't been useful enough for most of my life for her to bother finding one. I kept the eulogy. I framed it, actually the 2 folded pages still creased from the night I practiced it out loud at my kitchen table with Soren listening. It's a strange thing to treasure something that was also used against you. But the words in it were true. My father really did have hands like maps. He really did build something lasting for everyone who came after him, even the daughter who didn't realize until it was almost too late, that lasting things are exactly what some people can't stand to share. So here's what I keep asking myself, and I genuinely don't have an answer. Would you have signed the disclaimer too if it came wrapped in the one thing you'd wanted for 6 years? Or is there a version of you cynical enough, even mid-grief, to read the fine print? Tell me below. I think about it more than I'd like to admit. Names and identifying details have been changed to protect privacy. This story is inspired by real events shared online and adapted for storytelling purposes.